Hi, and welcome to the Religion Bites podcast series. I'm Malory Nye, and this is episode 14 on the topic of agency and religion. In the last episode, I introduced the topic of intersectionality, the approach that tries to understand the overlap and intersections between categories of power and difference, such as race, gender, sexuality, religion, and so on. In this episode, I'm going to take that issue of intersectionality a little further, inasmuch as I'm going to ask further questions about how to understand the power relations of race, gender, and other issues of subordination in the context of religious traditions. A key idea within this is that of agency. That is, how do people who are in a subordinate position and who are marginalised from the main areas of power, how do they live with and perhaps overcome their powerlessness? The idea of the agent, the person with such agency, is one that recognises the person, not just the victim. That is, a person that acts on their own choices, on their own values and beliefs, and is not merely a pawn that is pushed around by those with power. Such an idea has been applied in the study of religion, with particular to religious traditions and contexts where women are found to have limited power. Perhaps the most well-known of these is within the context of Islamic and Muslim societies, and has been expressed most obviously in terms of the ways in which Muslim women may choose or be required to dress. On a broad level, how do we understand Muslim women within a patriarchal context? By being what they consider to be good Muslims, are they participating in their own exploitation by men? Or is there some other way in which we can understand women being happy to be Muslims, whilst at the same time challenging and resisting male and other structures of power? And in much discussion, it is when women do actively and obviously resist, rather than acquiesce, that scholars have tended to use the term agency as a way to describe and articulate the women's resistance to the power that is exerted upon them by others. This can extend far beyond the field of gender. It may also be applied within the context of racial and ethnic differences. Disempowered racial or ethnic groups expressing their agency by challenging the dominant group. Sexual differences, such as queer or LGBT groups having agency in the form of resistance or challenge. And indeed we could and should apply the approach of intersectionality here, looking at how different layers of power are resisted in different forms of agency, such as black women, black Muslim women, LGBT Muslims, and so on. All of these may have their own contexts and forms of agency, of challenge against the dominant power structures and groups. If we go back to the imagery of the intersection, how such people and groups drive their way through the entangled intersection. Such contexts of oppression and agency are in themselves not limited only to the contexts of Islam and Muslim women. Scholars have asked similar questions in terms of women in conservative Christian cultures, in Orthodox and conservative Jewish life, and in many other groups, including Hindu and Neo-Hindu and newly emerged alternative religions. The question has often been explored around contexts of choice, when women who have been raised with liberal, rather than traditional or conservative, gender values, choose to become involved with the religious groups, either established or new religions, in which gender roles are unequal and tending to place women as subordinate to men. Why should women wish to do this, and how do we understand their agency, their potential to change and resist, in such cases? Now this is a very fruitful approach to take. As we are beginning to find, where there is power, there is often resistance. Thus patriarchy is often accompanied by women's own individual and collective actions of resistance in many different ways. We can look, for example, to well-documented Christian women in American history who have resisted male and white power in different ways. For example, Anne Hutchinson in the 1630s against the domination of a particular form of Puritanism in the early Massachusetts Bay Colony, or important female figures of the black emancipatory era of 19th century America, such as Ida Wells, Sojourner Truth, and Maria Stuart. All of these women made a stand, they showed their resistance, and in doing so were clear and very obvious examples of the acting out of their agency against the established power relations. But one problem that has been observed in this approach is that it leaves out other women, the actions that some, indeed many women take that are not so clearly about resistance and challenge. Or to put this another way, is a person's agency only shown when they resist and challenge power, subordination, and discrimination? Can agency also be about exerting one's own sense of power and empowerment through compliance rather than resistance? This is a question that has been asked in a number of contexts, but is particularly associated with the scholar Saba Mahmood, who has written about religiosity among Muslim women in Egypt. She found women who were, on one level, very pietistic. They adopted the mainstream religious values, including wearing the traditional headscarf as an outward manifestation of modesty and faith. But at the same time, they acted according to their own form of agency, their own sense of empowerment. When trying to apply the usual understandings of agency as resistance to power, therefore, Mahmood felt that such approaches, to quote her, ignore other modalities of agency, whose meaning and effect are not captured within the logic of subversion and resignification of hegemonic terms of discourse. Or we can put this another way. Women, and other groups who are disempowered and discriminated against, can act with their own agency in ways other than challenging and resisting. In proposing this, it opens up the idea of agency to a wide range of issues and interpretations, which to some might make it so broad that it is almost meaningless. A recent article by Kelsey Burke titled Women's Agency in Gender Traditional Religions tries to make sense of this, and does so by proposing 4 different and distinct ways in which we can understand women's agency. That is, Burke breaks agency down to these 4 different types: resistance agency, empowerment agency, instrumental agency, and compliant agency. It's useful to remember that although this is specifically concerned with women's agency in Burke's paper, if we want to use such a breakdown of types of agency, they can also be used in other political contexts, such as race, sexuality, and so on, and also within the context of intersections of identity and agency, specifically black women's agency, and so on. So to take each of these types individually, we'll start with the first, resistance agency. For Burke, this describes women's forms of agency that attempt to challenge or change some aspect of the religion. In many respects, this is the classic or most discussed form of agency, since, as I've mentioned above, the concept of agency is very often about exploring women as resistors, changing the existing power relations. Burke's point, however, is that this is not the only means by which agency is done. Women may act out their agency in other ways, without obviously resisting or challenging. As an example of this type of agency, Burke cites the case of Catholic feminists who write letters urging leaders to reconsider the Church's official stance on women's ordination. Other contemporary examples may be the various Christian movements for things such as abolitionism, and movements related to LGBT rights in Christianity, Islam, and other religious groups. The second type of agency is empowerment agency. This type is somewhat close to the first, but differs in that it might not be about obviously resisting, but it is instead about the personal consequences and values of the women who are so acting. With empowerment agency, Burke argues that women reinterpret religious doctrine or practices in ways that make them feel empowered in their everyday life. In doing this, it could be argued that it may be an implicit form of resistance, since the women may be reinterpreting religious ideas in ways that make them meaningful and empowering to them. But it is not about openly challenging or seeking change, at least not in terms of outward or obvious circumstances. Burke argues that this is often manifest among women who convert, citing as examples women's conversion stories that usually don't involve the changing of life's circumstances, but rather the power to change one's perception of those circumstances. That is, such agency is more about a woman's subjective or personal sense of being empowered, which may be at odds with a more external or perhaps objective view, which sees her general disempowerment in relation to men. The example of Muslim women is a common example here. For many Muslim women in contemporary Muslim societies, and indeed in many respects in Western contexts also, the wearing of a headscarf, what is commonly called a hijab, is often viewed by Western outsiders as a sign of the woman's subordination by men, in general, and in particular by the men of her family. But a woman may in fact be wearing the scarf to enable her to participate more easily in a life beyond the domestic sphere. It enables her, within a largely male-dominated society, to leave the home in safety and comfort, to study at university, and to have full-time employment. All of this may not be possible if she chose to not wear the scarf. Thus, the scarf can not only make her feel empowered, it may actually empower her, inasmuch as it opens doors that would otherwise be closed, by men in general and by other women. The third type of agency is instrumental agency. Again, this type of agency overlaps with the previous one. The approach to such instrumental agency is that the actions of the woman have positive and advantageous results that are not necessarily related to her specifically religious motivations. In a lot of ways, such instrumentality may be about empowerment, and if so, it will mean that the agency is both empowering and instrumental. Thus, the Muslim women who wear headscarves to be able to work or study are exercising an agency that is both instrumental, inasmuch as it means they can work, and empowering, as it gives them the power of being employed or educated. Similarly, Burke uses the example of Colombian women who convert to evangelical Christianity and then convert their husbands. In doing so, they gain greater standing and position within the community and additional leverage within the household. Thus, their religious conversion is again both instrumental and empowering. However, instrumentality may be for other ends than specifically empowerment, even though in the study of agency it is empowerment and challenge or resistance to power that most approaches emphasize. One example may be from Burke, of an American Muslim woman who veils and notices that her male co-workers value her intellect rather than her appearance. A difficult question here is that the religious action, the agency, may not have been taken specifically for the instrumental result, which may just be a side product of the action rather than a desired cause. In this case, the agency is indirect rather than specific, which rather weakens it as an idea or an explanation. The fourth and final type of agency is compliant agency. This final type, according to Burke, is for her an attempt to overcome the limitations of the previous three approaches. It does so by recognizing agency in women who participate in gender-traditional religions for reasons other than those outlined above. That is, it's an agency which is about going along with or complying with the requirements of a male-dominated patriarchal religion. The example she uses here is of Mormon women who view acts of submission as necessary to become goddesses in heaven after death. But of course similar examples can be used of conservative women in Christianity, Islam, or any other patriarchal religious contexts. For Burke, to quote her, compliant agency suggests that women exhibit agency in the ways in which they choose to conform to religious teachings, and she notes that women may do so in different ways. She argues that this approach recognizes the sensibilities and embodied capacities that Saba Mahmood says are contained within religious customs and traditions. In other words, she says, the ways in which women understand their world, what they are capable of, may lead to intentional acts of conformity or resistance, and both of which should be considered as agency. Or to put this another way, a woman's choice to comply with aspects of religiosity that from the outside are clearly identifiable as oppressive or patriarchal is in itself a form of agency. Or if we put this in a different context, a slave in the American South in the 19th century may have been in forced labour, but she or he may still have had agency when complying with the requirements of the slave owner. Although there are examples of slaves who resisted and led revolts, such as Denmark Vesey in Charleston, not all enslaved people did so. It's not helpful to say only those who resisted had agency. We have to look for other means and contexts through which the agency occurred. And this is the hub of the issue of agency. On one level, it is heartening and progressive to look for resistance, challenge, and empowerment in acts of women's and others' agency. But agency might not always show us such resistance. Burke raises as a possibility for understanding this the work of the writer Orit Avishai, for whom women exhibit agency when they do religion. That is, the agency is part of the practice or the embodiment of the religion, the acting out and doing of beliefs, values, understandings, ideas, requirements, and power. This in itself is an idea that is worth exploring, and I will discuss this idea of doing religion in a later episode. To bring this together, however, I just want to finish on this idea of agency as something that all people have, whether it is an agency that challenges or complies with the predominant power structures. And on reaching this point, we should realize that the point of this is not simply to ask the simple question of whether or not a particular action by a person is one of agency or not. What is more important is how the action, the person, and the context all mobilize agency, in what ways, with what outcomes, and how is it perceived by the actors involved. These are the questions that the idea of agency helps us to ask. Otherwise we have the problem of trying to determine the person's true intention. Did they do it to change things, to challenge, to assert themselves? When as highlighted by, for example, the writer Phyllis Mack, women might say something about their action that is at odds with how we might interpret it. This doesn't matter, since we are describing what they do and how they do it. In sum, the concept of agency tells us there are people involved, not only ideas and structures, but people living and working within particular contexts, making decisions and finding their way between and within the structures and relations of power. We will look at this in more depth and from other perspectives when we come on to later the issue of doing religion, the practice of culture. But that's all for now, so thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.